closest we'll ever get to seeing Marie Antoinette's wedding dress. When Marie Antoinette got married in 1770, records described her wedding dress as a silver court gown covered in diamonds. This dress, which was made in Paris 4 years later for the wedding of Hedwig Elizabeth Charlotte, Queen of Sweden and Norway, very closely matches the description. It's in the robe de cour style, the most formal type of dress that you could wear at this time. And both Marie Antoinette and Hedwig would have worn theirs with detachable lace sleeves. Marie Antoinette's wedding dress was made in France prior to her arrival in Versailles, so it was cut to estimated measurements and no fittings were done. When she tried it on for her wedding day, it was too small and there wasn't enough time or fabric to make alterations to the dress. She had to walk down the aisle in a dress that was partially unlaced at the back, and you could see her chemise peeking through. The robe de cour was the standard dress to wear at the French court and had been since the time of Louis XIV in the 1600s. But Marie Antoinette hated it, calling the style obsolete and insufferable. And it was at her insistence that her husband, King Louis XVI, relaxed rules at the royal court to allow other styles of formal dress to be worn.
I find this picture very haunting. This was taken 4 years before World War I, and these are 9 kings. It might be the only photo in existence of 9 kings ever taken. Not only were all these guys friends, but a lot of them were related. And I'm not just talking about distant relatives. The heads of Russia, Germany, and the UK were first cousins. These two guys could be twins. This is Tsar Nicholas of Russia and King George of Britain, and they may as well be brothers. They were frequently mistaken for each other at weddings and events. After this photo was taken, 4 of these monarchies would cease to exist. One of these leaders would be assassinated, and 20 million people would die because of these guys' egos. Many of them grew up together or shared a grandmother, and when the war started, some of them tried to cover up these connections. Like the UK royal family today is known as the House of Windsor. That changed in World War I. Before that, they were the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, but that sounded way too German when they were literally fighting the German. He's like, oh, can't have everyone, associating me with my cousin. This picture just represents like the final gasp of that old world that was just disappearing and dying.
He was forced to impregnate 6 Irish women. If he said no, they threatened to kill him. This was not sex, it was forced labor. Labor done with the womb. In 17th century Barbados, colonizers, to make more money, devised a cruel plan. They made Irish women and enslaved African men reproduce. One man said they lined up 6 girls, the girls were all crying, and he was shackled in chains. The colonizers told him, "If you do not get them pregnant, we will make you die slowly." He was not a father, he was a machine for reproduction. The Irish women were told to lie still and be quiet. The enslaved black people were told to perform, and the children born in that silence were mercilessly sold away. This was not mere survival, this was biocapitalism. The colonizers believed that mixed-race children would become stronger laborers, so they bred them like livestock and erased all the records. Imagine being forced to create life and then forced to watch it be sold away. They called it a white lie, but we call it mass colonial rape. If they erased your family's past, share this as well.
Accidents that changed the world forever. In 1902, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt went on a hunting trip where he refused to shoot a bear that had been captured, deeming it too cruel and unsporting. The story spread rapidly and was then turned into a popular political cartoon. Inspired by this, toy makers created a stuffed bear and called it Teddy's Bear in honor of Roosevelt. The toy became a huge hit, and the teddy bear went on to become one of the most beloved toys in history. In 1895, a German scientist named Wilhelm Röntgen was experimenting with electrical tubes when he noticed a strange glow on his hand, which revealed his bones. He realized the electrical rays could pass through solid objects, but not the bones, leading to the development of X-ray imaging, which transformed medicine forever. In 1941, a Swiss engineer named George Mistral was walking through the woods with his dog when he noticed small, prickly seeds clinging to his clothes and his dog's fur. Upon examining them under a microscope, he discovered the tiny hooks on the seeds that allowed them to attach so effectively. Inspired by this, he created a type of fastening system, leading to the invention of Velcro, which revolutionized how things are fastened in a wide range of industries.
You would think in a society where murder was really just a daily occurrence that the Romans would have come up with some way to handle these injustices, but they really didn't. If someone was murdered, it was actually the family's responsibility to take the killer to court. And even then, if the accused was found guilty of murder, they didn't get sent to prison or get executed. They simply owed compensation. And there really was only one crime that the Romans found so horrifying that they prosecuted the individual at the state level. And that crime was parricide. And they came up with an equally horrifying punishment for this. Now, parricide is the intentional killing of one's parents. And the Romans were terrified of their own children killing them. I wonder why. And the punishment for parricide was the penalty of the sack. In the sack's classic form, the person was beaten or flogged. Then they were sewn into a leather sack with several live animals, typically a dog, rooster, viper, and monkey. And then they were thrown into some body of water, typically the Tiber. But even with how insane this punishment was, the accused was still taken to court. By the time of Augustus, these cases of parricide were handled by imperial or senatorial courts. And even then, the sentence was not automatic. It had to be pronounced by a magistrate or a governor. That means if your brother, mother, daughter, uncle, what have you, was brutally murdered, it did not matter to the state. Only mattered if the killer was that person's child. Outside of parricide, crimes were strictly handled by the family and oftentimes not even taken to court.
Here's your daily dose of historical tea. The all-female crime syndicate that ruled London for over 100 years? Yep, you heard that right. A girl gang that lasted over 100 years, and for perspective, most gangs rise and fall within a decade. The gang was based out of Elephant and Castle, South London, which is how they got their name. They started in the 1800s and were active well into the 1950s. Their specialty was shoplifting high-end fashion. Unlike male gangs, no one saw them coming. Women in fashionable clothes didn't raise any suspicions. Plus, these women were masters of disguise. They sewed hidden pockets in their coats, skirts, and even baby strollers, all to smuggle out stolen clothes, jewelry, and cosmetics. They didn't just steal, they ran a fencing network to resell everything for profit. One of their most famous leaders was Alice Diamond, nicknamed Queen of the 40 Thieves. She was tall, glamorous, and wore a diamond knuckle duster ring. Under her, the gang ran like a corporation. They recruited working class women, trained them, and enforced loyalty with strict codes of conduct. And unlike the regular gangs, they didn't rely on brute force. They relied on style, charm, and cunning. These women could walk into luxury shops in London's West End, look respectable, and walk out draped in stolen luxury goods. And their success lasted so long because they adapted. During Prohibition, they smuggled alcohol. During wars, they dealt on the black market. They always seemed to know how to make money from the chaos. Rumors say that judges and police were very hesitant to crack down hard on these women because they were fashionable and respectable looking. The patriarchy ironically worked in their favor. By the 1950s, better shop security and harsher crackdowns finally ended their reign. But for decades, the 40 Elephants were the most feared and the most effective criminal organization in Britain. Honestly, legendary.
In the Middle Ages, women caught committing adultery often faced one of the most terrifying punishments: the goat torture. The victim would be tied to a wooden frame, her bare feet plunged into a bucket of strong salt water. Soon, her skin began to sting and burn, tiny cuts on her feet turning numb under the salt. Then, the executioner brought in a goat. At first, it looked harmless. The goat gently stretched out its tongue, licking her feet. At the beginning, it might even feel a little ticklish. But as time went on, the goat's rough, sandpaper-like tongue scraped the skin over and over until the surface split open. Salt seeped deep into the wounds, sending waves of burning pain. The victim trembled uncontrollably. This torment could last for hours until she finally passed out or died in agony. But here's the horrifying part. This wasn't the only way society tried to control women. They even invented the chastity belt. It locked the most private parts of the body with no way to clean, no way to bathe. Women were forced to wear it day and night. It was meant to protect morality, but in reality, it became a slow and living nightmare. So, tell me, which do you think was worse? The goat torture, or being forced to live inside a chastity belt?
How was male betrayal prevented in the Middle Ages? Surprisingly, in some parts of medieval France, married women developed a chilling but effective method to keep their husbands faithful. Each morning, wives would discreetly mix a tiny dose of poison into their husband's breakfast. But this wasn't meant to kill them. It was a clever control tactic. Every woman possessed a specific and unique antidote, carefully matched to the poison she used. When the husband returned home at night, she would give him the antidote, neutralizing the toxin before it caused real harm. The purpose was clear. If a husband stayed out too long, perhaps drinking, gambling, or visiting other women, he would begin to feel the effects. Nausea, headaches, vomiting, and even breathing difficulties served as painful reminders to return home on time. This method created a powerful incentive for men to come back quickly each evening, discouraging late-night adventures and potential infidelity. Of course, this dangerous game sometimes ended tragically. If a husband was delayed unexpectedly, the antidote arrived too late, and some men didn't survive.
There was a male loneliness epidemic in the Victorian era as well, and nobody had stronger opinions on it than this old coot. Amelia E. Barr believed that an old bachelor was useless without a wife, but the old maid was actually useful for society. Amelia writes, "The unmarried woman is becoming every year more self-reliant and more respectable and respected, and the unmarried man more effeminate and contemptible." By the way, she had been married for 17 years until her husband passed, and she had a daughter. Amelia continues, "We look for a day, not far off, when a man will have to become a member of some religious order if he wishes a reputable excuse for his celibacy. Even in secular life, it would not be a bad idea to clothe bachelors after 40 years of age in a certain uniform." Amelia! She, in the same article, also writes, "Old bachelors have no excuse whatever for their condition. If we omit the natural and necessary exceptions, which are few enough, then pure selfishness and cowardice must account for every other case. Their despised old bachelorhood is all their own fault. They have always had the tremendous privilege of asking for what they wanted, and half the battle was in that privilege. Men don't have wives because they don't ask for them, and they don't ask for them because they don't want them, and in this condition lies their shame and their degradation and the well-deserved scorn with which the married part of both sexes regard them. As for the old maids, she believes their singleness is more calculated than it ever had been before. She writes, "They will not waste the days of their youth in looking for a husband in order to begin their lives. These old maids have strong individuality and refuse to give up their time to another's keeping. The force of character displayed by such resolutions naturally leads to celibacy." Why? No one but a very weak man would be attracted by women of such vital purpose, and weak men would not be tolerated by such strong women. Amelia also wrote romance novels, so what do we think about her opinions? Some of them sound like something you would see on Twitter today. Some sound pretty harsh. Some sound maybe correct. Let me know what you think in the comments.
They wore something beautiful, but it was also something deadly. In the early 19th century, a dangerous fashion trend swept through the wardrobes of Europe's elite. It was called the muslin dress, made from an incredibly thin and weightless fabric, so light they called it air. You could wear. Women wore it directly on their bare skin, then soaked it with water to make it cling tightly to every curve of their body. The goal was simple: to look more sensual, more unforgettable. Even in freezing winters, they refused to wear anything warmer, because being beautiful was worth the risk. But the fabric had no warmth, no protection. It absorbed the cold and held it against their skin, turning elegance into ice. Soon, Paris was hit with a wave of pneumonia and influenza. Doctors recorded as many as 60,000 new cases per day, and the majority of deaths were among women, especially those who wore muslin dresses. What was meant to make them look like angels ended up stealing their breath and taking their lives. The muslin dress was not just fashion. It was a soft and silent killer.
Back in the Tudor period, having a learning disability could get you a rather interesting job. Welcome to Disabled in History. This is the series where we discuss famous historical figures who had or may have had a disability or condition. And today we're covering the Fool of Mary I. Allow me to introduce you to Jane. Jane wasn't just the Fool of Mary I. Previously, she had been the Fool of Mary I's stepmother, Catherine Parr. Possibly before that, she may have been the Fool of Anne Boleyn. This is speculation and unproven. Now, to get the role of a court jester, you didn't have to have a disability or condition. But for those who did, there was a very particular phrase used for them. And that term was natural fool. Now, if we look at this painting, which is indeed Jane the Fool, we can't see anything of her physically different. So, historians lean towards her having a mental disability or particularly a learning disability. Much of Jane's life is a mystery. We know nothing of her childhood. We don't even know her surname. We don't know where she was from. We don't know who her parents were. We don't know if she was married, though there has been speculation that she was married to Will Somers, who was the fool of Henry VIII. And we also don't know anything of her later years. But while working as a fool in the Tudor court, she did have some luxuries. One of these was her clothing. She owned an obscene amount of shoes, and her clothes were very high quality. Many of them were silk, coming straight from Mary the First Silkwoman. We really don't have much more information on Jane besides her hurting her eye at one point. But she's still an example of someone with history with a mental disability. If you're interested in people in history who had disabilities and conditions, you should check out my playlist and also follow me. And if you know someone who should be included, drop it in the comments.
If white people sat at the front of the bus and black people sat at the back of the bus, where did Latinos sit? Did we sit in the middle, or maybe there was a color scale of if you were a darker Latino, more towards the back, if you were a lighter Latino, more towards the front? What about job opportunities, schools, water fountain? Did lighter-skinned Latinos get the best of both worlds? Maybe some days they were filling the white fountain, other days the colored fountain. Now the general answer is Latinos were considered colored people. However, there is a lot of nuance to this situation. Now, racist white people, they were smart. They knew that there were so many Latinos in the United States that if they categorized them as colored people, there would be a problem. You can't have black people and Latino people working together. You would be outnumbered. So what do? You divide and conquer. From a legal standpoint, white people decided that Mexicans and Latinos would, for the most part, be considered white. And what Mexican-American lawyers then did is they went to the courts and said, hey, if we're legally white, we have to get all the benefits of being white, which put racist white people in a bind. They're like, okay, so we want them to not consider themselves people of color so they don't work with the black people, but we definitely don't want them to consider themselves white like us. So they did what they always do. They used trickery and deceit. They said, okay, fine, on paper you guys are white, but in practice, no one will ever consider you guys white. And so even though they were technically white, signs started getting put up from both white people and black people saying, no Mexicans. And rest assured, even though it said no Mexicans, they meant no Latinos. However, there's still a lot of nuance to it because the region you're in depicted whether it was enforced strongly or weakly. For instance, border towns, a lot of them were like, Mexicans are white, cool, they can come in and buy our food and buy our services, and we're just not going to force the fact that they're not actually white. In places like Los Angeles, where the Chicano movement was born, where Latino pride is the largest in our entire country, they had issues with the police because police were like, no, you guys are colored people, period. In Miami, where there's a lot of light-skinned Latinos, they didn't enforce it because they're like, I can't even tell looking at you guys, so don't even worry about it. This is why Latino pride starts really strong in the left of the United States and slowly depletes the more right you go. As you can see, it's not as easy to simply say, well, legally Latinos were white, so they were treated like white, which is simply not the truth. As well as you can't say that, well, Latinos were colored and they were treated like black people, because once again, that's not true. Sometimes it is, but it depended. The whole reason racist white people try to paint this as white versus black is because they don't want you to realize the truth. It's not white versus black, it's white versus black. Indigenous, Latinos, Asian, Middle Eastern, Jewish, and yes, even other white people. That's right. White people hate other white people. The Irish and Italians did not have a good time here. Hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Happy Latin Heritage Month, and have a magical day.
What is a fact from history that seems too dark to be true? How about the fact that one night in the 1940s, every baby born inside of one Memphis hospital was stolen? This is coming from a Heart Starts Pounding episode, but one night, a 21-year-old named Jessie Henderson gave birth to a child in John Gaston Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And afterwards, a nurse comes in and says, I'm so sorry, but your baby has passed away. The nurse doesn't tell Josie how the baby died, but she says, you need to go to reception and they'll get everything sorted for you. So Josie's walking down the hallway, and as she is, she sees another woman out there crying who was also told that her baby just died. And then she sees another woman who's crying and was also told that the baby she just gave birth to had died. All in all, there were about 7 women in the hallway that had all been told that their babies had died, and Josie starts thinking that this is kind of weird. And Josie didn't know it yet, but every baby born in the hospital that night was stolen by this woman, Georgia Tan. Georgia was a social worker and she was friends with everybody at the hospital, and her dad was a judge, and she basically came up with this sort of kickback program. She basically told the nurses that if they took all the newborn babies and gave them to Georgia and told the mothers that they died, she would be able to sell them to adoptive parents and she would give them a little bit of the money that she earned. And I know it sounds absolutely unfathomable, but Georgia did this to 5,000 children, and I basically did a 2-part series on her for the Heart Starts Pounding podcast, and you can start listening to this episode. She says she was a social worker and then children started disappearing.
Did you know that not every vow of chastity was respected in medieval convents? Because there's a part of history that hardly anyone talks about. Many nuns would simply vanish in the middle of the night. They escaped the convent to live secret romances with priests, and in some cases, with other nuns. These escapes became so common that they started showing up in the church's own official records, and when they were caught, the punishment was brutal. Some were locked away for years in tiny cells, with no contact with the outside world. But the worst fate was saved for those who brought the most shame to the order. They were buried alive inside the very walls of the convent. Yes, the monastery walls hid more than just prayers. Many of these cases were discovered centuries later, during renovations or demolitions, when bones were found inside the structures. In other words, behind the silence of the nuns, there was a secret world of forbidden love, escape, and horrifying punishments that history nearly erased.
If they taught you these 5 events in school, you'd question everything about this country. But they didn't. And that's not an accident. 1. The Ocoee Massacre, 1920. A black man tried to vote in Florida. A white mob responded by burning down the entire black community, killing dozens. No one was ever punished. Gone from textbooks for 100 years. 2. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, 1950s-70s. The U.S. government drugged its own citizens with LSD to test mind control, including students, prisoners, and patients. Some died. And for decades, it was completely denied. 3. The Great Wall of Benin, pre-colonial Africa, longer than the Great Wall of China built by Africans, not Europeans. The British destroyed it, stole the artifacts, and then acted like Africa had no history. 4. Native American boarding schools, 1870s, 1970s. Hundreds of thousands of Native children were ripped from their families, forbidden from speaking their language, and buried under white names. Thousands died in silence. Unmarked graves are still being found today. 5. The coup in Iran, 1953. The US and UK overthrew Iran's elected leader for oil. It destabilized the entire region, and we've been feeling the consequences ever since. But you won't see it in US history books. They didn't just erase these stories, they erased the people who lived them. Click follow, because history only works if we tell the whole truth. Here are some crazy facts about ancient Egyptians. Women in ancient Egypt who worked in the weaving industry were entitled to take days off during their menstrual period, acknowledging the need for rest and cleanliness, a rather progressive practice for his time. Ancient Egyptians had a form of tipping at banquets called ha, meaning please, where they would give money and gifts to the servants in hopes of ensuring better service. The Tarkan dress is considered the oldest woven garment in the world, dating back over 5,000 years. Found in a First Dynasty tomb at Tarkan, an Egyptian cemetery, it signifies the sophistication of fashion even in ancient times. Egyptians invented the pin tumbler lock, a type of lock that is still in use today. These were quite sophisticated, made of wood, and used keys also made of wood. Ancient Egyptians were among the first to identify and document different brain parts and their functions, understanding that it was involved in sensation and movement.
Let's talk about the dark history of Clara Bow. Because Taylor Swift is releasing a song about her, but not many people know the real story of the real woman. Clara Bow was an actress in the 1920s known for being the first it girl. And that's because she was literally in a movie called It. Like, that's where the phrase comes from. And though she was probably the biggest actress of her day, her life was still pretty tragic. And this is all coming from the recent podcast episode I did about her entire life, but Clara's mother was schizophrenic who tried to kill her multiple times as a child. One of the worst times was after Clara booked her first movie role. She hated that her daughter wanted to be an actress. Clara's life was also plagued by scandal. At the height of her career, her secretary Daisy sold a bunch of lies to tabloids and they published this book about her. This book accused Clara of multiple affairs, of bestiality, of horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. And when it came out, it actually caused Clara to have a psychological break similar to her mother's, and she was institutionalized by her husband. And tragically, she was never able to get her film career started again after that. She ended up dying in isolation at the age of 60 from a heart attack. If you want to know more about Clara's life, either before or after you listen to the song, definitely check out the podcast episode I just did about her because we get into everything that happened in her life.
Imagine living in a time when having small breasts was a true privilege. In the Middle Ages, the beauty standard was the complete opposite of what most people imagine today. A beautiful woman, she was the one with almost no chest. The smaller, the more desired. Men went crazy, seeing it as a sign of purity, delicacy, almost a divine virtue. But women with large breasts, they suffered. A lot. They were viewed with suspicion, considered too provocative, even dishonorable. To escape the prejudice, many would wrap themselves tightly in cloth, trying to flatten their chest, all to appear as if they had less. But if that didn't work, humiliation was certain. A woman with a full chest was quickly associated with promiscuity. Not fit for marriage, not fit for court. Society was cruel, and appearances ruthless. In the minds of the medieval elite, the rule was simple. The fewer the curves, the higher the value.
We need to talk about Johnny Depp's portrayal of the Mad Hatter, because it is full of dark history Easter eggs that you may have missed. If you know of the character the Mad Hatter, then you may also know about the dark history of hatters. For 250 years, people that made hats were using a poisonous mercury-based solution that caused their bodies to fall apart and for them to slowly lose their minds, which I just did a whole episode on that and other deadly beauty and fashion trends that you should check out. When Johnny Depp got the role of the Hatter, he became obsessed with the dark history of hat making, and he wanted to include parts of that history in the character. And the biggest homage he pays to that history is with the orange hair. The mercury solution that hatters used to use was called carroting solution because it was so bright orange. They would sit in these poorly ventilated rooms all day, just inhaling the poisonous mercury, getting sicker and sicker. And Johnny Depp wanted to honor that. He wanted the skin to be pale and sickly. He wanted his teeth to look like they were decaying because that's what would happen to these people. And finally, and this is my favorite detail, he put a lot of details into the costume to make it look like he was a hat maker. Up here in his hat, there's tools to make hats. He has a ring that's a push pin, and on the other side, he has this belt of thread so he could be sewing hats all day. Anyways, I have so much more on the dark history of hatting in this week's episode, and you're definitely going to want to check it out. I never realized that it's nearly impossible to know what Ed Gein actually sounded like, but I think someone on the internet just found a recording of him. And spoiler, it sounds absolutely nothing like the show. Also, I cover a lot of stuff that's morbid but interesting if you want to follow along. So I had heard Charlie Hunnam say in interviews that he really didn't know what Ed Gein sounded like going into filming the show. There's really only 1 or 2 recordings of Ed Gein, and both of them were almost destroyed after it was decided that he was unfit to stand trial. There's also not really any footage of him. For the longest time, people just had to go off of descriptions that people who knew Ed Gein gave. Like Harold Schechter in his book Deviant says that someone who talked to Ed said he spoke freely in a low voice, frequently with his head in his hands. But there is one documentary that says that they have the original tapes of Ed Gein, and it's Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein, streaming on MGM+. And I believe this YouTuber took a small portion of that and uploaded it, and take a listen to what Ed Gein actually sounded like.
Would you enjoy it while you were doing it? What's the worst part of it? I mean, they didn't then. I knew better, restless. When you dig the grave up, you were kind of in the hay, too, is that it? That's good. I could just...
This is the most disturbing story ever stitched together in American history, and it is absolutely terrifying. In the 1960s, in the quiet, seemingly ordinary small town of Fairbrook, Ohio, everyone knew Helen Ward, a friendly lady, always sitting silently on her porch with her sewing machine. Her quilts were famous, with designs so detailed they seemed to come to life, almost breathing under dim light. I lived in the house next door, and I always found it curious how some patterns resembled veins and even scars. She said she bought rare fabrics from distant suppliers, but I have never once seen a single installment. Sometimes at night, a strange smell would slowly come to drift out of the basement, a mix of burnt leather and something I couldn't immediately identify. No one was asking. Helen was too dear, and their quilts were in almost every house in town. In 1975, a fire unexpectedly destroyed part of his house. As firefighters extinguished the flames, they discovered carefully wrapped rolls of cloth in the basement. It just wasn't canvas. It was treated human skin, sewn in delicate floral patterns. Next to it, a list with 15 names of missing women, each one carefully marked with the phrase "Project Finished." Comment Helen for Part 2. This is the real-life Mary Poppins. She didn't come with songs or magic. She brought something sweeter and far more dangerous. Her name was Mary Ann Poppins, and in the autumn of 1909, she took a position as a living nanny for the Harcourt family. They remembered her as soft-spoken, precise in her habits. Each morning she mixed a spoonful of powder into the children's porridge. She called it a remedy for nerves. At first the change was subtle. Henry grew listless, too tired to play. Beatrice forgot her letters. They both began waking at night, unable to stop shivering. When Mrs. Harcourt questioned her, she smiled and said, "A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down." 3 weeks later, Henry died quietly in his sleep. The doctor blamed an infection, and Mary Ann left before anyone thought to question her. It was only months later, while reading the evening paper in silence, that the Harcourts read her name in the papers. Mary Ann Popplewell, wanted in 3 counties, 4 households, at least 6 children dead. She wasn't a magical nanny, she was a drifter with forged references and a jar of sweet poison she carried from one family to the next. Comment Mary for Part 2.
Do you ever wonder what happened to Christopher Robin when he grew up? Great, I'm gonna tell you. If you were unaware, Christopher Robin is real. He's this kid. He's A.A. Milne's son, and the books When We Were Very Young, Now We Were 6, Winnie the Pooh, and The House on Pooh Corner are all written about him. Nowadays, those are some of the most popular stories in the entire world, but back in the 1920s, they were also some of the most popular stories in the entire world. In fact, they became world famous when Christopher Robin was only 3 years old. So the Milne family had a Christopher doing some crazy stuff for publicity, including feeding this real bear honey. Like, he climbed in the cage and he fed the bear honey. Now, as a kid, this was all well and fine with Christopher Robin. He was one of the most famous people in the entire world, and he was soaking it up as like a 6-year-old. Around the age of 10, Christopher was sent to boarding school. And at boarding school, he was no longer the most beloved child in the entire world. Why? Because these were the kids who grew up with Christopher Robin being the standard for boyhood, being this is what you should be. And those boys were ruthless when they got to meet the real-life Christopher Robin. One of these kids acquired a record of Christopher Robin singing as an 8-year-old a song version of a poem his father wrote about him saying his prayers. The poem is called Vespers. The boys played this song to annoy Christopher Robin relentlessly. In fact, the only reason they ever stopped is because they wore the record out so much that it wouldn't play anymore. There was a parody of the poem which normally goes, "Whisper who dares, Christopher Robin is saying his prayers," and it was changed to "Nobody cares, Christopher Robin has fallen downstairs." And once those schoolboys heard Christopher Robin has fallen downstairs, they started pushing that kid downstairs. Now you may think to yourself, where were Christopher's parents during all of this? Well, now despite what you may think, A.A. Milne actually was not good with kids or parenting. His wife, Daphne Milne, was also not very great at it. They were very aloof, very proper people. A.A. Milne actually wanted Christopher Robin to be a cricket star, so that's a little fun fact. So then what does Christopher Robin do after boarding school? He joins the army. Or he tries. When World War II broke out, Christopher went to enlist. He sat in the chair and he was shaking so much, he was so excited, and according to him, he was so excited, and they were like, that might be a medical thing, you are not allowed in the army. So Christopher went to his dad and was like, "King and country, can you get me in?" And his dad was like, "King and country, I can get you in." You may think that A.A. Milne is anti-war, and he was, but then he stopped being anti-war, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, eventually, Christopher Robin got into the army, and what did he do in the army? Well, he got stung by a scorpion, he contracted malaria, he discovered a new type of landmine, and he had shrapnel removed from his head after being hit by a shell. Actually, some of the shrapnel stayed in his brain for the rest of his life. I read somewhere that he killed 28 Nazis during the Battle of the Bulge, but I don't know how to fact check that, so don't take my word for it. Sometime around the Second World War, Christopher Robin sits down and he goes, "Gee whiz, I think I was child exploited." And he is understandably not pleased by this realization. Also during World War II, A.A. Milne slams another writer, P.G. Wodehouse, in the press,
A.A. Milne says something like, P.G. Wodehouse told me if he had a son, he would have to be born at 15, and that shows you how irresponsible P.G. Wodehouse is. I'm going to read you P.G. Wodehouse's response. You misunderstand me, Mr. Milne. I was simply talking as one businessman to another. When we authors have infant sons, our first thought is to cash in on them. By the time you had finished exploiting the commercial properties of the young Milne, infant sons had reached a saturation point, and there was no more money in the game. After the war, Christopher Robin's relationship with his parents never got any better. It got a lot worse when Christopher married his first cousin, which was kind of a strategic move on his part because, you see, the cousin that he married was the daughter of his mother's brother, who his mother hated. So Christopher literally chose that side of the family over his own. Christopher Robin never took any money from the Winnie the Pooh books. He actually refused to. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the other Christopher Robin. Like, he hated that annoying little kid in the books. When Christopher eventually accepts some of the money, he gives it to his daughter with cerebral palsy. I forget her name. And what doesn't go to his daughter goes to other kids with disabilities. He opens up a bookshop with his cousin wife, and they live a very happy little life. So every time you're watching Winnie the Pooh, you can think of that. You're welcome.
It has just been brought to my attention that a lot of you have no idea what Watergate actually was or think it was really boring, and that could not be farther from the truth. This story includes espionage, burglary, kidnapping, corruption at like the literal highest level. This story is wild. It's also so relevant to today, so I'm going to try to explain it in the simplest, most fun way I can. What a lot of people don't seem to realize is that history is like 90% tea with a little bit of spy stuff thrown in. So part of the reason people think it was boring is because it was so expansive. It involved like, I think 69 indictments and 48 convictions all together, but we're not going to get bogged down in all that. I'm going to give you like the fun stuff. Okay, so it's in 1972, Nixon is president, and one thing you should know about the guy is that the guy is sketch. Okay, he is not a good dude. Like, the guy would literally weaponize government institutions against journalists if they reported on some of his buddies in a negative light. Also, the FBI was super sketch at the time, and I have plenty to say about them in this era. Like, I could go on for hours. But weirdly, in this story, they're kind of the good guys. CIA, not so much. So Nixon is in his first term, and just like every other president before and after him, he's got a committee going, basically planning out his next campaign. CRP, Committee for Re-Election of the President, or CREEP. CREEP is staffed with a bunch of interesting people. A couple of former CIA guys, former FBI, all sorts. And because Nixon is in the White House at the time, there are also people on his actual staff that are part of these efforts. So basically, CREEP and a bunch of staffers in the White House come up with Operation Gemstone. Basically, it was a bunch of clandestine or illegal acts proposed to be used against the DNC. The whole thing is kind of wild, but I can go over that at another time. Among those plans is a plan to basically bug and spy on the DNC HQ, which at the time was set up at the Watergate complex. There were 2 break-ins staged to look like burglaries if they were caught. They rented a room at a Howard Johnson's across the street where one guy, former FBI, posted up to kind of keep an eye on things and then also like track the wiretaps. And they broke into the DNC headquarters and wiretapped a couple of phones and took photos of a bunch of documents. Even though the installation of these bugs was successful, a few weeks later they decided they had to go back in for repairs. During the operation, a couple of high-up CREEP guys who were basically running this whole thing were keeping in touch with each other and the burglars with secret microphones. Chapstick microphones were later found by the FBI in a White House safe belonging to one of them, which is actually pretty clever if you think about it. Okay, so late one night, security guard Frank Wills, he's a hero so I'll use his name, is doing his rounds and he notices that a bunch of doors have tape over the latches so they can be closed without locking. So he removes them, not thinking much of it. A little later, he's doing his rounds again and he finds that a bunch of the doors have been re-taped. So then he calls the cops. Police then dispatch an unmarked car with these guys that were called the Bum Squad because they were often undercover dressed as hippies. Remember the guy across the street at the Howard Johnson's keeping an eye out on things? Well, unfortunately, he got distracted watching Attack of the Puppet People. So he didn't even realize that the cops had showed up and were investigating until it was too late. So 5 burglars were arrested and then indicted. And immediately the FBI is like, something's up. Because 2 of them had info for 2 super high up guys in Nixon's administration and CREEP in their address books, firstly. And Nixon basically immediately starts trying to stop their investigation into the funding of the burglary. Okay, this is where it gets wild, if that wasn't already wild. U.S. Attorney John Mitchell had recently stepped down to become like a chairman of CREEP. He was about to get in a whole lot of trouble, and he knew that his wife, Martha Mitchell, knew at least one of the burglars who had been arrested and was like all up in the news. And he knew that if she spoke to reporters, she would reveal that fact. And if the press caught on to the fact that his wife knew one of the burglars, they would know that Nixon's administration was all tied up in the Watergate scandal. So what did he do? He had her kidnapped, because of course he did. So he instructs her security detail to not allow her to speak to the press at all. But Martha, hats off to her, is on the phone with a reporter telling her that she's going to leave her husband unless he steps down from CREEP, when the line suddenly goes dead. Basically goes missing. Eventually she was tracked down by journalists like a week later at a Westchester country club, looking visibly bruised, claiming that she had been held captive for a week in a California hotel room. She was under surveillance and sedated, everything. So some of the boring stuff is all the financial stuff they figured out, but long story short, the FBI finds that a check that was made out to CREEP, literally, for campaign donation, was signed and deposited into one of the bank accounts of one of the burglars. In the end, they figure out that all 5 burglars have either direct or indirect connections to CREEP, and that this is, in fact, a vast spying and sabotage plot on behalf of Nixon's campaign. And guess what? He wins again anyway. So anyway, we've got the crime and then the cover-up and then the cover-up of the cover-up. So in spring of 1973, things are getting hairy for Dick Nixon. The judge is now receiving allegations of perjury in the trial of the burglars, and he's gotten a letter from one of the burglars alleging like a high-level cover-up. So the people around Nixon and his top aides are all starting to be investigated and looked at. He realizes he's got to isolate himself so he can claim total innocence, and basically starts asking for resignations. It's during these talks between certain aides where one of them suspects that they're being recorded in a meeting in the Oval Office. He testifies to this suspicion in front of the Senate, which basically blows the lid off of the Nixon tapes. As it turns out, Nixon recorded everything. Wild. Of course, he gets subpoenaed. He claims executive privilege. He tells the AG to fire the special prosecutor. Sound familiar? The AG refuses and instead resigns in protest. Nixon then turns to the deputy AG, asks him the same thing. He resigns in protest. He then looks around the entire department for someone who will step up and agree to fire the special prosecutor and just let Nixon off the hook. He finds that guy, and his name is Bork. Fitting. Everyone around Nixon gets indicted, and Nixon is secretly named as an unindicted co-conspirator because the DOJ basically claims that a president can't be criminally prosecuted until he steps down. Nixon is eventually forced to release the transcripts and then the tapes, and basically no one is on his side after that. In fact, when he announced this decision in a speech, people were like, like, bravo, he's doing the right thing, until they started reading the transcripts. Even his former allies in the media had, nothing good to say. They called him disgusting, evil, stupid. It was brutal. When the tapes are finally released, you can hear Nixon undoubtedly committing crimes, including discussing hush money payments. And it's discovered that there are 18 and a half missing minutes from one of the tapes. This has been the subject of much mystery and speculation in the years since. You've probably heard someone talk about it at some point. His secretary tried to take the blame, just like everyone else around him, and claims that she messed up with the recording. But analysis in 2003 showed that it was erased in several separate segments, at least 5, but up to 9. Basically, everyone's lying. Surprise, surprise. And considering how bad the content of the tapes that we did hear actually was, those missing 18 minutes really are a big deal, because how bad could they be? Everything's spiraling towards impeachment of Nixon until finally the smoking tape is released. A previously unknown tape is released with recordings of Nixon just days after the Watergate break-in, where Nixon is talking about how the CIA can obstruct the FBI investigation. It proved that he was involved in the cover-up from the very beginning. He resigns within a week. In that last week, his aides that he had previously promised pardons to are begging him, trying to secure those pardons. Never got him. Also kind of sounds familiar. Finally, in August of 1974, he gives a resignation speech full of bullshit, with claims like he always tried to do what was best for the nation, and saying that he, quote, must put the interests of America first. Where have I heard that one before? And then, kicker of all kickers, his vice president, Gerald Ford succeeds the guy and within a month issues a total and unconditional pardon. Lets him off scot-free. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we got here in 2024 in the United States of America.
What? I have a diary from a man who owned an insane asylum for women in the 1800s. And the entries are very telling. If you're new here, hi, my name is Chelsea and I return lost heirlooms to families. And excuse this right now, I just got up from a nap. This artifact is just another great example of the oppression of women over time, and the idea that women are considered to be insane for having thoughts, opinions, and ideas. I mean, until recently, historically speaking, women were really only viewed as vessels for childbearing. And unfortunately, that's still the case today in many places. But back to this diary, it is very telling that the owner of this asylum for women was a man. So if you assume that the care or the lack of care was brutal, you would be right. And that, of course, many of these women did not belong there and were just thrown into an asylum by their husbands. Right now, I only have a first name and a state for the owner of this diary, but I'm trying to use records from my heritage to narrow down who this could be and who the descendants are. But I want to get back to a historical point, and that's that at this time, in the 1800s, women were just viewed as property in almost every single state. Husbands could just throw their wives into an asylum without reason. Female independence and education was considered madness at the time. Per James Pritchard from 1835, if you don't know who he is, look him up. Women who studied or read were considered an eccentricity of conduct, which basically just meant they were morally insane. May this man not rest in peace. These women were locked away until they conformed to a more natural and feminine behavior. So think about how many women were locked away in this asylum who really didn't need to be and who were tortured. And again, any of these wives' husbands could just easily lock them away without proof of actual insanity, because again, it's the husband's word over anyone else's. When researching this more, I found the gross statistic that in male asylums, or in asylums where there were men and women, men rarely needed a straitjacket. Yet it was very standard for a woman to be constrained. And in many asylums, a clitorectomy was performed on a lot of these women. You can guess what that is. Think of the helplessness these women felt. I know they are clearly all dead, but I wish I could give each and every one of them a big hug. I'm running out of time, so I have to do part 2, sorry.
The head of Marie Antoinette's best friend was placed on a spike and waved around in front of her prison cell. Yes, this is the Princess de Lamballe. She was the long-term best friend of Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette was known to have 2 favourites in her life, Lamballe and a lady called the Duchess of Polignac. But Lamballe, I would say, was her firmest and most loyal friend. And in fact, when the revolution began and Marie Antoinette urged her supporters to leave, she urged Lamballe to leave, and she did. She went to London and then decided that she wanted to be alongside and supporting her best friend, so she came back. And she came back to France fully knowing that she could potentially put her life in danger, but she didn't care. She wanted to be with her best friend. Marie Antoinette and Lamballe were imprisoned together. However, in 1792, she was transferred out of Marie Antoinette's prison and to a separate one. During her time in prison, there was an outbreak of a massacre in Paris. The prisons were all seized by a mob of people, and the prisoners were forced in front of the mobs. Essentially, in front of the mob, they would ask you a series of questions about, your view of the nation, about whether you support the king, the queen, anything like that. If you gave the wrong answer, they would throw you over to the people in the crowd below, who would quickly dispatch of you, or not so quickly. On the 3rd of September 1792, poor Marie-Thérèse was brought in front of a tribunal. They stated to her, "Swear to liberty and equality and hatred of the king and queen." She replied, "Readily to the former, but I cannot to the latter. It's not in my heart." Marie-Thérèse abjectly refused to speak against her best friend, whom she had sacrificed her life to accompany and be with during the revolution. Marie-Thérèse was marched in front of the crowd. On the way, her father-in-law, who was watching the whole events, was begging her to rescind what she had said, begging her to state that she hated her best friend, but Marie-Thérèse refused. Once she finally saw the crowd and the bodies, she screamed in horror. She was pulled into the crowd, who savagely unalived her. There are varying reports about the way in which Lamballe died, but what we know is it was a brutal and savage assault. There are rumours that she was essayed by many men. Now, we're not quite sure what exactly happened, what is exaggeration, what is propaganda, but we do know that at the end of the horrific ordeal, she was undressed, her body was pretty much pulverised, in the best way to say it, and her head had been removed. Her head was placed upon a pike and paraded around the streets. They then brought it in front of Marie Antoinette's cell and paraded it around. Now, perhaps quite fortunately, Marie Antoinette was not actually in the room when this was taking place, so she did not see the head of her best friend. But the people who were in the room did see the head and screamed in horror, which people assumed to be Marie Antoinette, but it wasn't. And of course, being in another room at the time, the news travelled quickly to Marie Antoinette. Now, she could hear the shouts and screams outside, she wasn't quite sure what happened, and so when asking, she was told, "They are trying to show you the head of Madame Lamballe." Now, Marie Antoinette immediately fainted in horror. This is obviously one of the most horrific stories and tragic fates of anyone in the revolution. To me, I think this is the most tragic fate of anyone at Marie Antoinette's court. Whilst I don't agree with the unaliving of Marie Antoinette, as you can imagine, I feel extra strongly about Lamballe because whilst Marie Antoinette had her faults and for some parts did accept or have a responsibility, Lamballe was just a woman who happened to be at court who, was born into that. She didn't have a choice. She was a woman. You don't have much choice there. Genuinely, she had no political power. She had no power over anything. She was rich, of course, yes, but she wasn't doing anything. And that's the kind of sad reality was, okay, would you, upon being asked if you would swear your hatred to your best friend who you've accompanied almost all of her life? Because bear in mind, they had known each other for years. They had met when Marie Antoinette had just first come to France. Bear in mind, that was when she was 14 and Marie Antoinette at this point was around 36 years old. They knew each other for a long time. They had a very deep devotion. They were even accused of engaging in a lesbian love affair, although this is not true. Would you condemn your best friend even if you didn't politically agree or anything like that? I doubt it. I know I wouldn't. So my heart does go out to her, really, because she, out of anyone, again with Marie Antoinette, you can't claim her innocence because she wasn't entirely innocent. But Lamballe, she didn't really have anything to do with this apart from being in the wrong place at the wrong time and being best friends with Marie Antoinette. An incredibly sad story. But yeah, what do you think? And I'm more than happy to make a more in-detail video about the life of Lamballe if you'd like to hear it.
This is the true story of the Vatican, and it's purely horrifying. In the 1970s, Father Michael Harris, the Vatican's chief exorcist, faced a case unlike any other. A young woman named Anna was believed to be possessed. Her voice spoke ancient languages she couldn't have known. Strange symbols burned themselves into her skin. During the exorcism, Anna screamed something that made Michael freeze. She said, "The church knows. They've always known. You're just a pawn." Michael couldn't shake her words. He began to investigate and uncovered whispers about a secret sect called the Order of Darkness. This group, tied to forbidden rituals, was said to use demonic forces to maintain their power. Even worse, the symbol on Anna's skin matched one in the Vatican's oldest records, on documents connected to exorcists who mysteriously disappeared. When Michael brought this to his superiors, they told him to stop digging. Some truths, they said, are better left buried. But Michael didn't listen. He wrote everything in his journal, determined to reveal the truth. Then one night, Anna disappeared from the church under heavy security. Michael vanished too. The Vatican claimed he left for personal reasons. Weeks later, his journal was found, left on an altar in a sealed chapel. The last entry read, "The darkness is here. They know I've seen it. Pray for my soul." But there was one more discovery. Hidden in the journal's spine was a photograph. It showed Michael in his study, but behind him stood a shadowy figure with burning eyes. To this day, no one knows who or what it was.
This is what I'm really interested in. William Shakespeare once wrote to his wife, "Life is too short to only love you in one. I promise to look for you in the next." William Shakespeare's wife is named Anne Hathaway. Now, this is the actress Anne Hathaway and her husband Adam Shulman. So the playwright William Shakespeare, and she is an actress. This is the playwright, William Shakespeare. This is the actress's husband. Guys, what if he found her? The more photos you look at, the more you'll truly realize that their resemblance is uncanny. Like, this man really looks like William Shakespeare. And what are the odds that her name is Anne Hathaway? Not only does she look like William Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway, but they are both married. Shakespeare also said that Anne would be the famous one in the next life. Like, this is the type of history that I want to learn, and I really wonder if they talk about this. I feel like if this was me and my boyfriend, we would never shut up about it. Like, there's a picture online of some, like, emo-looking girl and Shaggy, and people always send it to both of us, and we never shut up about that. Come over here for more content.
Did you know it took 3 civilizations to invent ice cream? It all started in ancient Persia, where ice was stored in heat-resistant chambers called yakchuls. The nobles would have ice shaved from the store, blending it with fruits, vermicelli, and rosewater, creating a refreshing treat called faluda. Centuries later, when the Arabs conquered Persia, they put their own spin on the recipe. Instead of using raw fruit, they created fruit syrups to mix with ice. They called it sharbat, a name which would later inspire the word sorbet. Fast forward to the Renaissance, sorbet reached Italy through trade routes. The Italians fell in love with it and began experimenting, adding milk and egg yolks to their sorbets. They named this thicker version gelato. But the final touch came in France and England, where thick cream was added, making the treat even denser and creamier. And that is how ice cream was born.
The woman behind me is Lurleen Wallace. She was the first female governor of Alabama, and her story is one of the most disturbing medical disasters in history. Reminder, I tell a lot of dark stories on this channel. Severe discretion is advised, but follow along if you want to hear more. So this is Lurleen Wallace. She made history when she became the first woman governor of Alabama, and there hasn't been one since, actually. Some other things to know about her. She's also a mother of 4. She's also married to an egomaniac. This is her husband, George Wallace, and you will have feelings about him by the end of this video. George Wallace was actually the governor right before Lurleen Wallace, and he became famous for his 1963 Segregation Forever speech. So he was very pro-segregation and anti-civil rights. By almost every historical account, George Wallace had a near pathological obsession with power. He was one of the most powerful and controversial Southern politicians, and many aides described him as authoritarian, manipulative, and controlling to the point of cruelty. So here's another bit of information that's really important to know. Lurleen Wallace had uterine cancer, and it was really aggressive. Now, I wish that was the worst part of the story, but it's not, because here's what's arguably the worst part. Lurleen Wallace wasn't told that she had cancer, because in 1961, the doctor told her husband, George Wallace, because at the time, Alabama law permitted and often required medical information about married women to be disclosed to their husbands first, because they were technically their property. So George Wallace was told first, and rather than letting Lurleen make her decisions, he instructed the medical team not to tell Lurleen the truth. So she underwent a hysterectomy, believing that it was like a routine procedure. But the cancer wasn't fully removed, and she didn't know she needed to follow up with anything, and because her cancer was so aggressive, it continued to advance for years. Why did George Wallace not tell his wife about her cancer diagnosis? He later stated in interviews that he wanted to protect her from worrying. But privately, aides said it was more about control. He needed her functioning as a supportive political wife, not an independent patient with agency. Some people believed that she'd probably withdraw from public life, and that would have disrupted his political momentum. Because, yeah, people have a right to reflect on their priorities if they realize they have a life-threatening illness, but that's just me. I'm sure you're wondering, like, didn't you say that she was the first female governor? Yes, I did. Let's talk about it because it's just as fucked up. So it's 1965 and Lurleen began feeling unwell again. A second examination showed that the cancer had returned, but a sympathetic doctor finally told her the truth about her cancer diagnosis. But by now the cancer had gotten worse and had spread to the rest of her body. But in George Wallace's mind, he was the real victim here. Because, like, his term as governor was coming to an end, you guys, and he could feel the power slipping through his fingers. Now, he believed that his message was so important that instead of stepping aside and letting someone else become governor, he looked for a way to extend his influence without technically breaking the rules. Where have we seen that before? And who did he decide would be a good puppet candidate? None other than his incredibly sick, cancer-ridden wife, Lurleen Wallace. She had little political experience, but was beloved by the public. She was warm and soft-spoken, like a true Southern belle. Voters saw her as a continuation of George Wallace's leadership, but gentler, and he fully exploited that image. She ran for governor while undergoing repeated hospitalizations and radiation therapy, which is torture, by the way. In 1966, she became the first female governor of Alabama and won in a landslide. Newspapers called it historic, but George Wallace was still making every major decision behind the scenes, and she was governor just in name only. Her staff often cited how sick she was, and George continued controlling her schedule and public image. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. By 1968, her cancer had spread to her lungs, liver, and bones, and she only served just over a year in office. And in 1968, at 41 years old, Lurleen Wallace passed away. She's the only female governor in American history to have ever died in office. What happened to George Wallace after Lurleen died? I'll give you a couple bullet points, but I don't want to give him too much time because I hate him and he sucks. So, after Lurleen died in 1968, George Wallace ran for president the same year, running on his platform of being against civil rights. He actually survived an assassination attempt after being shot 5 times in 1972, which left him paralyzed from the waist down and in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He remarried and divorced twice. His second wife was 20 years younger than him, and his third wife was 31 years younger than him. And he lived the rest of his life in chronic pain, and I kind of love that for him. Historians often cite Lurleen's story as an example of patriarchal politics in its purest form, because this is all rooted in control and paternalism. The irony of this whole story is that she made history as the first woman governor of Alabama, which literally grants her the rights to govern the laws of millions of people, yet she was denied the most basic form of self-governance, the right to her own medical information, because she was a woman. Her death at 41 became a haunting metaphor for how women in that era were allowed to represent power, but never truly hold it for themselves.
No, you're not. I'm so sorry to tell you, you were not directly descended from Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette had 4 children. It took her so long to conceive. You can see 3 of them here. Her youngest, Sophie, died in infancy. Her oldest, Marie Therese, here next to me, she was the only child to survive the revolution. She married her first cousin and became the the Duchess of Angoulême, and she was queen for about 20 minutes. That's as long as it took for her husband to abdicate the throne. Her oldest boy over here, Louis Joseph, he was the heir to the French throne originally. He died before the revolution really got started of tuberculosis. I want to say of the spine. He is described as being very sick as a child overall. And then her second son, Louis Charles right here, he, after the execution of his father, he was taken away from his mother and treated really horribly. They made him get drunk, they made him learn swear words, say bad things, and eventually he died while still in captivity, basically. There were some pretenders saying, oh, I'm him, and that was shown not to be true. So that means that there are no living descendants of Marie Antoinette. Now, that does not stop people from saying that they are. You also will hear this about, like, Anne Boleyn. Neither one of them have any direct descendants. Now, I'm sure there's a good chance that you have an indirect relation to Marie. The very top are her parents. She was the 15th of 16 children, and some of them did make it to adulthood, but many had children, and so that would make a lot of sense that some people are related to her through her siblings, perhaps, but there's no one that is directly descended from her that is alive right now.
The Tudors are a deeply rotten people. And I don't just mean idealistically. King Henry VIII's leg was literally rotting off his body while he was alive. And his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, was so addicted to sugar that her mouth was rotting in her face. But she wasn't always rotted. Queen Elizabeth has one of the most interesting stories of the Tudor period. And we can at least credit her with putting an end to the Tudor line. Welcome to the story of Queen Elizabeth I. Born September 7th, 1533, to King Henry VIII and his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth is the namesake of both of her grandmothers. And before she was even born, Elizabeth had huge expectations to fill. Both of her parents expected her to be a little boy, their long-awaited male heir of England, and of course the reward from God for all this Protestant shit they've been doing. And so while the birth of the little princess was joyful, it was also seen as kind of a letdown and a big loss at a gamble that Henry had taken. But nonetheless, she was named Henry's heir, and she was actually given the title of princess at less than a week old. And at 3 months old, she was given her own household, which her mother, Anne Boleyn, just packed full of family members to look after her. But one of the most notable on Elizabeth's staff was not related to the Boleyn family at all. It was actually Henry's oldest daughter, Mary. Mary was Elizabeth's older half-sister, and Henry had stripped the princess titles from Mary to give them to baby Elizabeth. And in general, Mary's not treated very well at the household of her baby sister for like 3 years. Her dad ignores her, she's treated like shit. And in May 1536, Henry has Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, executed for hoeing on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Though of course her real crime is giving Henry a princess instead of a prince. And for most of Elizabeth's life, her relationship with Henry is pretty strained. Which I mean makes sense, because like how do you even work that out in family therapy? Like Henry's sitting there like, your mother had to die because you're not what I wanted. That is wild. But Henry seemed to despise Elizabeth's mother. Even after her death, he claimed that she had used witchcraft to seduce him and break him from the church. He had all the pics of her destroyed, and he had his right-hand holy man, Thomas Cranmer, who he had just worked with for almost a decade trying to put Anne Boleyn legitimately on the throne, and was the godfather of baby Elizabeth. He is now tasked with destroying this legitimacy of this marriage altogether. The thing he had just spent years and years doing, he now has to undo. So it all gets pushed through Parliament. Little Elizabeth is illegitimate, and Queen Anne Boleyn's marriage is annulled. She is in the history books as a fraudulent, illegitimate queen. So in the last 30 years, Henry's had 2 wives and made 2 daughters, and he's declared it all illegitimate. But very quickly after the death of Elizabeth's mother, Henry remarries, and he reconciles with his oldest daughter, Mary. However, that does mean that Elizabeth is now at the top of the shit list. He cuts her household budget a lot, like to the point that sometimes she doesn't even have clothes that fit. But things do lighten up between the innocent little girl and the monstrous tyrant father when Henry has a son, Edward. Henry's in love with his new wife, he's excited about having a baby boy, and his daughter Mary and him are in very good favor. So Mary goes to bat for her little sister Elizabeth and brings her back into the family. And don't get me wrong, Elizabeth is being very mistreated, but she's still incredibly privileged. Elizabeth was well educated and developed a close relationship with her little brother. They shared a lot of the same lessons and tutors. She was also really close to her governesses and her stepmothers. I mean, the ones that didn't die horrible deaths. And it was probably around the beheading of Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, that Elizabeth decided, hey, this patriarchy shit is fucked and I am never gonna get married and be at the mercy of some man. And Elizabeth was actually very close to her last stepmother, Henry's 6th wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was really motherly with Elizabeth, and she spent a lot of her energy focused on Elizabeth's education and instilling Protestant values. Catherine Parr is also who we give a lot of credit to for restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession behind their brother Edward. And Catherine Parr hooked these kids up with an education. Elizabeth loved academia, and she was a lifelong learner. By the time she died, she could read, write, and translate 10 languages. And as a child, she studied up to 5 languages. She studied grammar, math, dance, logic, and she was extremely academic and privileged with the absolute highest education. And she spoke and wrote so eloquently and beautifully that you can still look up her words to this day, hundreds of years later. And you can see her personality shine through in those words. It's incredible. And when Elizabeth is 13, her father dies, and honestly, she couldn't give less of a fuck about it. Because Henry has never given a shit about Elizabeth ever, and her very existence can be attributed to her mother dying, so Elizabeth is kind of just like, sucks to suck, hope my brother's not too sad about it. But Henry did the right thing in death, and he set his kids up with racks of cash. The kids get money, they get properties, they get the freedom to ball out. Of course, Elizabeth gets the least because she is the last in succession, and also her dad's heart. Her little brother is now the 9-year-old King of England, and her older sister got her bag and fucked off to the English countryside to do hot girl shit. So the orphaned 13-year-old Elizabeth is shit out of luck. Until her stepmother, Catherine Parr, invites her to come live with her and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. And Elizabeth lives with them for about a year until she's once again confronted with the lesson that men ain't shit. Because Thomas Seymour is cracked, corrupt, and perverted in every single way. And he's trying to position himself as a suitor to the 13-year-old Elizabeth, straight up trying to groom this child. Well, his wife is pregnant, by the way. But Catherine Parr caught him being weird as shit to Elizabeth, and Catherine Parr sends Elizabeth away from the household. There's more about that in the Catherine Parr video if you're interested. And then some shit goes down, and like a year later, Elizabeth is interrogated about Thomas, and Thomas gets beheaded for treason. And listen, Elizabeth is Protestant, and she is close to her brother. However, her brother talking crazy about skipping over her Catholic sister Mary to put Jane Grey on the throne is not sitting right with Elizabeth. And her brother Edward's like, you're not the boss of me though, so I'm gonna do whatever I want. And he concocts a plan to kidnap both his sisters and disinherit them. But one of Mary's supporters tells Elizabeth that her brother's actually dying and that he's got a plan to snatch her. So she throws her weight behind her sister Mary's right to the throne, with of course her being Mary's heir. Queen Mary's story is in the playlist, but it all works out and Mary takes the throne. But Mary starts getting really uncool with Elizabeth. Mary is being Catholic as hell as the queen, and the more she leans into that, the more it is positioning Elizabeth as a Protestant symbol, just like her cousin Jane Grey, amongst the increasingly disappointed Protestants in England. But Elizabeth is not playing into it. She's in her lane, she's moisturized, she's unbothered, she's flourishing, until her wackadoodle sister swaps her crown for a tinfoil hat and starts believing that Elizabeth is conspiring against her. Which of course Elizabeth is like, Mary, mama, what are you talking about? And Queen Mary is like, like mother, like daughter, get your ass in the tower. And Elizabeth is in her jail era. Her and her besties are doing time. And Elizabeth is like, let me try to talk us out of this. So she's writing her eloquent little letters to Mary, being like, hey girl, I'm innocent. I just wanted to reassure and confirm that with you. And eventually she's let out on a royal house arrest. Basically, the entire time her Catholic cult-ass sister is queen, Elizabeth is at risk of dying. Because of the Protestant supporters and the Catholic supporters, the two sisters existing are threats to each other's lives. These gangs are serious and they want to spill blood. And during this time, Elizabeth gets cozy close with Robert Dudley, who is one of the sons of John Dudley, the man responsible for that whole Jane Grey thing. So that was probably a little awk for Elizabeth, since her sister executed Robert's dad, but the two didn't seem to punish each other for the sins of the family. And honestly, this friendship is a little bit risky, since Elizabeth is this Protestant icon right now, and Mary is a Catholic queen, and his brother and dad just went down in that whole Jane Grey shit. And outside of the Jesus freaks, Elizabeth and Robert just faced the struggles of the times. Because Robert Dudley is already married, and it is not a good look for this princess to be ride or die with a married dude. But that won't stop them. And then in 1555, she's freed from house arrest to assist Queen Mary in birthing the new Tudor-Habsburg crossover episode heir. But famously, no baby occurred from Mary's birth confinement, and Elizabeth remained Mary's heir. And it seems like after this really tragic event for Mary, the two sisters got really close. Elizabeth was invited back to court, and she had a lot more freedoms and households that were more befitting to her status for the next few years. Robert Dudley's visits to Elizabeth got more frequent, and the two of them are live, laugh, lovin' together. But a few powerful people in Elizabeth's household do not like Robert Dudley hanging around, since let's not forget his dad and grandfather have both gone down for treason. And then in November 1558, Mary dies, likely of ovarian cancer, and with Elizabeth named as her heir, Mary refused to sign the death warrant her Catholic advisors had drawn up for the Protestant Elizabeth. Mary thought that Elizabeth was the most qualified person to succeed her, and advised her that when she dies, she would like to be buried with her mother, which Elizabeth did not do. But she was like, thanks for making me queen. That was great though. And so she becomes Queen Elizabeth I of England. And one thing about Elizabeth is she is a survivor. She has been counted out her entire life. She has never got the benefit of the doubt a moment in her existence. So my girl's got a lot to prove, and she rules England for the next 44 years. She takes them through the golden age of their economy. She watches the economy crash back down at the end of her reign. There's a lot going on in those 44 years, and I cannot wait to tell you about it in the next one.
Do you know how the US grew from just a few colonies into a giant 11 times bigger, and all within 100 years? Back in 1776, North America was divided between Britain, Spain, and indigenous lands that Europeans hadn't taken yet. At that time, the 13 British colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence and declared themselves the United States of America. After years of fighting, Britain officially recognized their independence through the Treaty of Paris. The U.S. gained vast territory all the way to the Mississippi River and began actively settling it. In 1803, a massive land deal with France doubled the size of the U.S. through the Louisiana Purchase. A few years later, Florida was partly taken by force and partly purchased from Spain. After Texas split from Mexico and joined the U.S., the Mexican-American War broke out, and in the end, the U.S. gained the entire West. Mass migration of Americans along the Oregon Trail led to an agreement with Britain. The border was set at the 49th parallel. A deal with Russia added Alaska, the last big piece of the puzzle on the continental U.S. map.